Anybody volunteers? Or I'm going to identify someone and ask them to read. Shubhangi, have you read at all in these past 6 classes? Shubhangi, are you there?
Yeah. No, I haven't read.
Okay, good. So please share your screen. Open the reading. It's in the chat as well, and it's on the files tab as well. So you can try sharing and start reading the first section. Are you having trouble sharing, Shubhangi, or finding the file?
No, I'll share my.
Okay. It's still blank, huh?
No. Uh,
Or do you prefer someone else shares it and you will read?
yeah.
Okay, can someone else share it?
I can do that.
All right. Well, let me try. Maybe I can share it. One second. You can try. I will also try here. One second. And there it is. You're sharing it? Okay, fine. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, just zoom in. Sorry, I was mute. Shubhangi, start reading.
Okay. So Siam's La Sara's declaration, the undersigned architects refused categorically to apply in their working methods means that may have been able to illustrate past societies. They affirm today the need for a new conception of architecture that satisfies the spiritual, intellectual, and material demands of present day life. Conscious of the deep disturbances of the social structure brought about by machines, they recognize that the transformation of the economic order of social life inescapable brings within the corresponding transformation of the architectural phenomenon. Town planning. Town planning is the organization of the functions of collective life. It extends both the urban agglomerations and the countryside. Town planning is the organization of life in all regions. Urbanization cannot be conditioned by the claims of pre-existent aestheticism. Its essence is of a functional order. This order includes three functions: dwelling, producing, relaxation, the maintenance of species. Its essential objects are division of the soil, organization of traffic, legislation. The relationship between yeah. The relationship between the inhabited areas, the cultivated areas, including sports, and the traffic areas are dictated by the economic and social environment. The fixing of population densities establishes the indispensable classification. The chaotic division of land resulting from sales, speculations, inheritances must be abolished by a collective and methodical land policy. The redistribution of the land, the indispensable preliminary basis of for any town planning, must include the division between the owners and the community of the unearned increment resulting from works of joint interest. Traffic control must take in all the functions of collective life. The growing intensity of these vital functions, always checked against a reading of statistics, demonstrates the supreme importance of the traffic phenomenon. Present day technical facilities, which are constantly growing, are the very key to town planning. They imply the offer a total transformation of existing legislation. This transformation must run parallel with technical progress. Uh, Architecture and public opinion. It is essential today for architects to exercise an influence on public opinion architecture through the baneful effects of academic teaching, opinion has strayed into an erroneous conception of the dwelling. The true have been pushed back behind entirely artificial sentiment conceptions. The problem of the house is not posed. Clients whose demands are motivated by numerous facts that have nothing to do with the real problem of housing.
Hello? You can't hear. Can anybody hear? Or is it my network?
No. We also can't.
Okay. All right. So where did she stop? Can you highlight that portion so I can continue reading? Okay. So I'll read. Clients whose demands are motivated by numerous factors that have nothing to do with the real problem of housing are generally very bad at formulating their wishes. Opinion has gone astray. Thus, the architect satisfies the normal prerequisites of housing only poorly. This inefficiency involves the country in an immense expense that is a total loss. The tradition is created of the expensive house, the building of which deprives a large part of the population of healthy living quarters. Through educational network carried out in schools, a body of fundamental truths could be established forming the basis for a domestic science. For example, the general economy of the dwelling, the principles of property and its moral significance, the effects of sunlight, the ill effects of darkness, essential hygiene, rationalization of household economics, the use of mechanical devices in domestic life, etc. Scroll down. Arham, just scroll down. Yeah. The effect of such an education would be to bring up generations with a healthy and rational conception of the house. The generations, the architect's future clients, would be capable of correctly stating the problem of housing. Okay. So, can somebody, when you read this, when you look at this charter, this charter, by the way, it's a charter, right? It's one of the early manifestos of modernist architecture, and what you understand about what is important to understand about this is that it was a collectively drafted document. You know, it was not one person's ideas. It was something that there was an architects conference and this was written down and then everybody endorsed it. You know, it was a kind of a manifesto. So this is how the architect, okay, not everybody, not all architects, but at least one group of influential architects at that time in 1928 were thinking. This eventually led also to the Athens Charter, which was in 1933, right? So it's important to understand the period that we are talking about as well. Now, before we get into this text itself, it's just as you know, just for the sake of a background. You all have studied modern architecture. Can someone very quickly summarize some of the, provide a little bit of a historical, background to modern architecture, and some of the, the dominant conceptions that were, or the principles that the modernist architects practiced and preached. Anybody can do that? Anybody? Shravan? Not Shravan. Anybody else? Not even Ambika. Somebody else. Tanvi, go ahead.
It was mostly about, using reinforced concrete and steel and having very straight and vertical lines, like keeping everything very minimal.
Right. So
And to do the
right. So that's important. Of course, there was a certain kind of material palette which was preferred. But what was it for? What was the idea behind it? It was not like, that they liked concrete, or it was only an aesthetic movement. What was the thinking behind it?
It was also that they wanted to keep it exposed to, like, being true to the material, and I think it was because of industrialization, like using something new. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
So again, I'll ask the question, I'll rephrase the question. Was it simply a desire to be different? Or just because concrete is, say, I don't know, industrially made? And why would they choose a material which is, reveal the true nature of the structure or whatever, Why was that necessary? Why did they feel it is necessary? Or to ask it differently, why did that aesthetic of ornamentless or a building free of ornament, why was that um, celebrated? Come on, you know this. I know you know this.
And now I'm more confused about what to say.
Oh, go ahead, give it a shot.
So
Must be
I
some thinking behind it.
Yeah, so it was also about experimentation, and like you are talking about ornamentation. So I feel that those modern architects felt that it was a waste of material and they were using a lot of resources. So they wanted to reduce, save on that as well.
Sure. Okay. So one concern could have been efficiency, or making the best use of available resources, or building quickly and cheaply, for instance. That's true. That was definitely a concern for them, and you can see that in some of the charters. They will talk about efficiency, and they'll talk about making do with less, and so on. But is there some kind of a context to this? Are they coming from a certain kind of political perspective, or is there a certain kind of movement against something? What are they fighting against? What is it that they're challenging?
I think they are challenging history and the conservative values.
Like conservative values, like? Wait, hang on, Shravan. Conservative values. Yeah, you're doing great, Tanvi. Just it's not a questioning. It's a conversation to provoke thinking. I'm basically behaving like a 6-year-old child, asking why. After everything you say, I'm going to ask why.
So it may be the conservative thinking of like everything needs to be depicted like exactly how it is. So earlier it was they used to everything was very gaudy. Everyone you wanted to show off their wealth and everything. So I think they wanted to move away from that and stop uh, that exploitation of material as well.
Mm, mm. Okay. Anybody else wants to come in?
Maybe they were focusing more on the dwelling rather than just aesthetic, like more ornamentations.
On the you mean on the function of the building rather than on the
Yeah,
ornament?
like how they're imagining how one could live in there. So in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a very important phrase which was kind of considered to be one of the 1 second, 1 second. Which is considered to be one of the slogans of the modernist ideal, right? Can someone remind us of that?
Ornament is crime.
Yes, and there was one more.
Can I say that one too if I can have a go? Form follows function.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so who came up with that, Shravan? Since you said that, form follows function.
Okay, we studied him in TOS. Did his name have an Allen somewhere in the middle?
Sullivan?
Louis Sullivan, yes, yes. Ambika, sorry, sorry, you're the only one who's politely asking. Everybody else is just, unmuting and talking, which is also fine. I'm not complaining about that, but just unmute and say it, all right? Don't wait for your turn. It won't happen. And this is a subject where everybody will want to talk. For once, there will be a lot of participation. I'm very sure of that. Okay. So yeah, it was Louis Sullivan, who was also the mentor of Frank Lloyd Wright, if you guys know the history a little bit. And I don't know if you have seen Sullivan's buildings, but they don't look like Corbusier's buildings. He was actually a transition phase from the earlier styles of architecture to the modern one. But the idea really was to really adopt modern techniques in order to build. That was one very important dimension of modernist architecture. But you should also think a little bit about, and I know that this probably has not been discussed very much in theory of structures and so on. But the thing is that there was a socio-economic context to this. Okay, it didn't come out of thin air. It was not about 4 or 5 architects saying, "Arey, chalo, let's do a new style of architecture." It was not like that. You have to understand that historical changes take place in a context and a circumstance. As Marx once famously said, people make their own history, but they don't make it in circumstances of their own choosing. Because the circumstances are not chosen by people who make history. Circumstances are pre-given. You're born into them, right? So what were the circumstances that led to these kinds of formulations? All right, we'll get into the form follows function a bit because it's a little deeper than what you think it is. But just to explain the context a little. So this was a period, we are talking about, one of the first early, what is considered when you do a history of modern architecture, you'll probably be shown the Crystal Palace. Can anybody talk about the date of the Crystal Palace, when it was built? Without Googling it. You know the Crystal Palace, you must have seen it. No? Nobody's heard of Crystal Palace?
No, we have heard, but like the timeline is something.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
What was so special about the Crystal Palace?
It was the first building that only used like prefabricated steel.
Yeah,
and glass.
exactly. Right. Yeah, it was in a way, a kind of a pioneering work of architecture because it completely prefabricated, assembled on site, and so on. Yeah. But that you'll be. Can you guess the date of the Crystal Palace?
1860s. 63, I suppose. 1863.
You Googled it, didn't you, cheater?
No.
Yeah, it was 1860s. So 1860s. It's very early. What we consider the modernist movement proper, really, one talks about it from the Bauhaus, right, in the 1920s and so on. So 1860s is one of the early kind of influential works of modernist architecture. But so you can see that the seeds were already there. There were people who were thinking about, okay, how do you build with the modern techniques, with the new industrial technologies, rather than in the old style. So that was definitely one. The technological dimension was an important, contributor to the modernist ideas. But there was also another one, and this had a lot to do with the kind of early 20th century political ideas, and especially if you see, for instance, the way in which Adolf Loos and others were formulating the question. Architecture was earlier the something that was mainly, the services of an architect really were sought by the powerful, kings, politicians, dictators. These were the people who hired architects, churches, big institutions, and so on. 1 second. Yeah, so the services of the architect were sought by people like that, right? And for the modernist architects, architecture was something that should be accessible to all, to a large part of society at least. It was something which should not only be confined to the powerful and the rich and the powerful, right? And in doing that, they would have to reinvent the technological basis of architecture as well as the aesthetic language. And so, and when you adopt modern technologies and then you put all of those, the fancy kind of ornament on it, it was, and a lot of people did that. So if you look at the even Sullivan for that matter, the buildings were built with steel and concrete, but the ornament was there, as a kind of, because that is what architecture was about. So it took a while for architects to for everybody in society to accept that you could have buildings without ornament, designed buildings without ornament. Many of the language of factory buildings became popular. The exposed brick kind of factories with those chimneys and the grain silos, and these were some of the images that the modernist architects borrowed from, saying that this is functional architecture. There is no ornament here; it is just a machine. And why can't our houses be like this? And not because of a style statement, because it is efficient to build like this. It's cheaper, it's affordable. More and more people can access this. And then by the 1920s, with the Bauhaus, there was a full-fledged kind of a socialist ferment within the architecture community, especially amongst the progressive architects. For them, it was about everybody should be able to live in, enjoy the benefits of science and technology. Why is it only for the very wealthy and the elite? We should design objects that are mass produced, and everybody can have cups, and everybody can, and beautiful ones, not just ordinary, tin things which are hammered into shape, but designed artifacts that anybody can afford, right? So you could harness the mass production and design as a craft and an art form to produce, and that was what Bauhaus was about. It was a synthesis of art, craft, and architecture and technology, right? And this could also then extend into all arenas of design, architecture, urban design, planning, all of that. So this was the socio-ecological, socio-political context in which the ideas of modernism took root. Of course, by the time you reach the 1930s and post-war modernist architecture was very different. So Corbusier, writing in 1916 and talking about the 5 principles of architecture, is very different from the Corbusier who's building Chandigarh. So just bear this in mind. The early modernism and the late modernism are two very different things. The early modernism is inspired by a certain kind of egalitarianism. The late modernism is inspired by monumentalism and the kind of expression of wealth, power, technology, and so on. So they are very different in that. But this is the early context, right? So this charter that we are seeing here, or that we are reading from, is that intermediate period, the transition from early to late modernism. But still, it's important. You can see in this language that there is an idea of functionalism, but there's also an idea of order. Architects should do this. We are the professionals. We are the experts on the built environment. We are the experts on how people should be living. It also has very clear statements. Today, nobody will write like this. Today, nobody will say that people don't know how to live in houses. No architect would dare to say that today. There will be a few exceptions, of course, but it is simply considered to be authoritarian as a statement. But at that time, architects said that because they had the kind of arrogance of knowledge, of knowing what is best for people. So you see these elements in this period, which are coming through very clearly in this charter, and by the time you reach the Athens Charter, it becomes even more clear. Corbusier was also part of it, and it basically says this is how cities should be made, this is how houses should be built, this is how people should live. Everything else is wrong. Everything that was done earlier is wrong. Everything that anybody else is saying is rubbish. This is the right way to do it. Yeah, and so this, but nevertheless, there were certain important things here, or which are worthy of thinking about. One is that there was a certain kind of collective spirit among the architecture community. They wanted to do things together. It was not about individual architects making style statements for themselves. It was a movement of sorts. So there was that political intent. It was authoritarian nonetheless. It was still, it had a collective kind of expression. There was an element of trying to think about what is best for people. Today, in fact, you don't have that. Nobody will say that. But today, architects don't even think about that to a large extent. Either it's a business or it's an art form or it's this, that, or the other. It's an individual expression and so on. But the idea that together we can think about the problems of society, that's hardly ever there. Maybe in a few institutions somewhere here and there, but otherwise it's not. Right? So this is an important historical period for, in architecture school, this is given a lot of importance, the modernist movement and these early charters and what experiment people did. It's not because, at least I don't think it is because people who teach in the schools think that this is how we should build today. I think it is important to recognize that this was a very important historical moment in the in the profession, where there was a kind of a collective ferment and a collective urge to do something, and to understand problems of society and to do something about it together. And that is really significant to my mind, at least. That is what is significant about the modernist movement. But again, make the distinction between the early modernists and the late modernists, the early ideals and the late projects that post-war modernist projects and so on. Okay, so this is an important period, 1928. But the next text that we are going to read is a critique of high modernism, late modernism, right? From James Holston's text. It's a fairly academic treatment, and that if you read that book, it spends a lot of time critiquing Chandigarh, okay, and Brasilia. So it is not talking about the Bauhaus modernism, right? It is talking about high modernism of the Chandigarh variety. Okay, so we'll go to the next text. Tanay, why don't you read? Tanay, you have read before. Tanay, are you there?
Yeah,
Have you read before?
no.
No. Okay, so please read the second text. Yeah.
Siam Planning proposed to solve the urban crisis of capitalism by adopting the technical and rational arguments of public health uh, legislation in context of comprehensive strategy of public works and good government. As we have seen thus far, it expands this strategy into two ways. First, it considers the entire planned city as a state sponsored public domain. Second, it proposes to distribute to all residents and benefits of this collective organization on the basis of a master plan for development. In yet a third way, Siam conceived the strategy of public works. The discourse of urban reform in the 18th and the 19th century was often presented in the terms of metaphor of disease, in an analogy between cities and the human body. The city was diseased organism and required radical surgery in form, I think that's form of planning operation to cut open its afflicted parts to make incisions with broad avenues through congested quarters in to rehabilitate the city's lungs with new parks and 54th. As we have
It's
seen,
so forth, not 50. So
that, yeah,
I
even
think
have
there are these typos while copying and pasting. There were some errors. So that's so forth, huh? Not 50.
yeah, and so forth. As we have seen, Le Corbusier also adopted his rhetorical device of describing cities as malignant growths. However, Siam based its planning prescription not so much on a model of the organism as a model, but as a can you, okay, where are we? Okay, on a model of the machine. Okay. In Siam's analysis, the solution to the crisis of the machine is to be found in the machine itself. The machine has destroyed the cities of the first machine age, 1730 to 1930. So called, it would be the salvation of the cities of the second. Nearly all the avant-garde movements viewed the machine as a potential source of liberation. The machine, that vast modern event, will be seen in the Radiant City for what it is really, it really is: a servant, not a ruler; a worker, not a tyrant; a source of unity and not of conflict, of construction and not of destruction. This is a prognosis. Okay,
Prognostication. In this prognostication,
the machine will liberate society from drudgery of manual labor, freeing women, especially from domestic slavery, and both men and women a new measure of humanity. However, it would destroy national and class boundaries. It would create international and inter-class communication. It would equalize for society to realize the benefits of this vehicle of social progress. Cities would have to be planned in harmony with its development and use. The simplest way to do this, Siam proposed, would be to treat the new city itself as a machine. That is, to plan it as an engineer plans an industrial process by conceiving the city as an industrial product. This new city would be organized not as a metaphor of machines, but quite literally as a machine for living, as Le Corbusier once described the house. In this organization, the city would be broken into essential functions. These would be tailorized, standardized, rationalized, and assembled as totality. Thus, the totalizing scope of modernist planning derives from its conception, the city as a machine. For machine, never partially designed or partially constructed, only its completeness guarantees its functional working order. Yeah. Is it? Is it? Is that it? Aram? Okay.
no,
Continue.
In these machine cities, the architect no longer designs individual objects. Instead, the architect organizes these objects into processes, into functions, interrelations, and communications, and plans their future development. Only through this kind of total planning, in which the city is ordered as an industrial assemblage, could its complexity be controlled, and could the potential benefits of the machine be extended to all classes of residents. Thus, unlike pre-modernist planning, the Siam city took as its organizational model the very event which had destroyed pre-industrial cities, the machine itself. The purely technical arguments that one is developed to justify their planning proposal, thus derive in part from public health and administrative concerns, and in part from the model of the machine in industrial production. However, this constellation of technical arguments is linked to comprehensive reassessment of the functions of the city. The model of machine entails not simply breaking the city down into essential functions of housing, work, recreation, and traffic. More significantly, it demands reorganization, at the same time reconceptualizing these functions. It proposes to relate them through a master plan which will ensure that each one performs its assigned task in harmony with others, as the gears of a machines do. The modernist model, however, does much more than just provide a blueprint of a functional order. It cannot simply accept the identity of these functions as they had developed in chaos of the 19th century cities. Uh, Aram, could you take them? Yeah. The new architecture therefore set out to redefine systematically the social basis of each function. It does not simply redesign apartment building. It proposes to restructure domestic organization and the family as an economic unit. In completely separating pedestrian and vehicle, it not only abolishes streets, it also eliminates the type of urban crowd and public activity that streets support. In planning a city in a park of playing fields and gardens, it does not simply green the city. More significantly, it proposes a new focus on sports for the displaced public activity of the streets. Uh, The design of modern factories, commercial facilities, and superhighways reconceives the relationship between residence, work, commerce, and between the market and the marketplace. Together, these redefinitions constitute a program of social change in which institutional structures had previously characterized each function are radically transformed.
Okay. Just go keep it go up. Aram, let's look at the text again. Does anybody have any response to this text? Any interpretation? Anything that you want to clarify? Anything that was not clear? Any kind of response? No one? Yes, sure. Go ahead.
So, from what I could understand, the gist of it was that they were trying to look at how the city how urban planning is damaging to the social aspects of the population and the environment in some sense, right? Not the environment in a very climate change sense that we see now, but rather how like the environment affected human life on a immediate scale.
Yes, yes. Of course. I mean, the general view at that time obviously was that it was difficult to think about. You see, for a very long time, until very recently, until a few decades earlier, to be precise, maybe from the rise of the environmental movements of the 1960s onwards. And if you look at the environmental movement in the 1960s, it was largely about environmental pollution and degradation, right? The awareness of the human impacts on the climate system, that's 1980s onwards, really. Before that, most of the general governing assumption was that that nature or the environment is basically an infinite resource and an infinite garbage bin. You can and it exists for our use. There is a lot of emphasis in the amongst the modernists of function and use. Now, even when you look at the idea of form follows function, right? What so there is a certain sociological dimension there as well. It's not only about simply saying that when you design, don't use ornament. It's not simply saying that if you're making a table, which is essentially in its bare elements just a top and four legs, you do only that. Don't have a little molding there. Of course, that is what is implied aesthetically speaking, but there's also a dimension of okay. There was you see if you I don't know if you guys have watched some of the movies or these series on um, uh, what's her name, the novelist Jane Austen's novels about the English countryside and the aristocratic lifestyle of people at that time. There was much, especially amongst the rich folk, a large part of what makes you stand out in terms of status as different from the rest of society is that you live a life of leisure and consumption. There was an important sociologist, American sociologist named Thurston Veblen, who spoke of it as conspicuous consumption. You consume things and you live a life of leisure in order to show others that you live a life of leisure and consumption. You cannot be bothered by doing things or having useful things. Things are useful, yes, but more important than their use is their ability to display and flaunt your status and wealth. This was generally society was hierarchical in terms of status, position, wealth, and so on. And what you start seeing in in this period, this 20th, early 20th century onwards, is that there is a change a certain kind of democratization of society. And we are obviously talking mainly about the Anglo-Saxon, the Western world. Um, and there is a kind of a re-valuation of values, essentially. Many of these things which are seen as being wasteful, as being unnecessary, uh, existing without any particular use in the functional sense, are seen as some kind of vestiges of a hierarchical past, and ought to be done away with. If you were, if you people were more oriented towards making things useful in even in life, not just in terms of what they made or built, right? So that idea of form follows function is multifaceted. It doesn't only mean that don't put ornament on your designs. It also means that there is a certain kind of emphasis that what is useful is important, what is wasteful is not important. It's a value statement as well. It's not just a kind of a doctrine that says how you should design. And this is what you see. Even Holston is talking about that. The city stops being thought of as as a place where that just happens. It's no longer naturalized. A large part of this thinking also is that one starts looking at human institutions. You start looking at everything in your life as human made. It can be changed, it can be transformed. Society is not natural. Society is human made. It can be changed. If somebody is ruling over you, it's not like it is the will of God. You can transform it, you can change it, you can change society, you can change cities, you can change everything. It's a kind of a Copernican moment, you can say, where you're no longer seeing yourself as the center of the universe, but a part of it. But yet in social life you're seeing that all human relationships are man-made, essentially. So the city is man-made, so why not build it like a machine? Machines work so well for us, why not build our cities like that, right? So you start seeing this idea of um, uh, trying to visualize or imagine every aspect of life as a kind of something that can be fixed. So in amongst the modernists, you start seeing this happening. The city, I mean, of course, you use the function, the metaphor of the body, the city as a diseased organism and all of that, the lungs and this and that. But you also see it as the machine metaphor becoming very dominant, where you can actually think. So it's not the metaphor anymore. The city itself is a machine. And when the city is a machine, what is the main design problem? If the city is a machine, how to make it efficient, how to make it run fast, how to make it run smoothly, how to remove all of the imperfections, how to remove all of the frictions, and the conflicts and so on. So Corbusier's designs, you will see, they not only try to make cities look like ordered and so on, but they also have to work like that. And this is, I mean, you can associate that with the period and so on, but it's also I mean, even today a lot of people believe this, base their work on these ideas. But the consequences of that on social life is something then starts becoming evident by the 50s and 60s, as more and more of these kind of high modernist ideas start shaping the urban landscape. And in the next text, in fact, we'll see what the sociological consequences of the Siam and Corbusier's ideas were, right? So, okay, anybody, any questions or comments on this before we move to the next text? All right, so just to make this a little more interactive, just scroll down to the last page. There is a diagram there. Yeah, so this is the radiant city, La Villa Reduce, right? I hope all of you have seen this diagram before. Anybody not seen it? Please raise your hands. Okay. 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 Fine. So that's not too bad. Only 2 people haven't seen it. Okay. So this is the radiant city, the diagram of the radiant city, which is in the last class we saw the diagram of the garden city. Okay. So think of it as a kind of a similar imaginary of what a city should be like. This time the author is Corbusier, not Ebenezer Howard. This is Corbusier. But you can see certain elements of Ebenezer Howard in this. Okay. However, what I want to do now is I want to ask all of you to read this drawing. Okay. And to tell everybody, what do you see here? What is happening in the city? Just zoom out a little. I think Aram is sharing this. Aram, just zoom out so you see the whole thing together. Yeah. Okay. What is happening here? What are the essential elements? Okay, this is also a diagram like Ebenezer Howard's. I don't think Corbusier thought that this would be exactly how it will be, but there are certain principles here. Can you identify those principles?
There's a certainty to it, as if it's kind of drawing out from a certain
No, we
axis.
can't hear you clearly, Shravan. Anyone else till Shravan fixes his mic? Aditya,
Yeah,
go.
there is like a straight like axis that is making the movements along all the spaces.
Okay,
Like
it's
there's
very
straight
it's very
connection.
orthogonal. That is correct.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
it's a very orthogonal plane. Okay. I mean, again, but that you can say because it's a diagram. You know, like this guy, Ebenezer Howard's diagram was very concentric and triangulated. Okay. But because it's a diagram, it will have a certain geometry. Maybe Corbusier didn't intend to have it. Imagine real cities like this. In fact, if you look at Chandigarh, it's not there are orthogonal elements in it, but there's also a certain kind of um, a certain organic flair to it. For instance, the Brasilia, which was not designed by Corbusier, but it has this kind of a bird-like plan. So it's not that it always had to be orthogonal. But that's an important element. There is a certain kind of geometric rigidity here. Well, what else do you see?
Division of functions.
Yes, very importantly, functionally very, very divided. Everything happens in a particular place. You dare not take one thing and mix it with another. But how are these functions divided up? What is happening where? Anyone?
I guess like it divided the residential as the main block in the center. Then the factory and other spaces at the bottom and the leisure spaces at the top.
Okay, so is the residential in the center everybody's residence?
It seems like it, but there looks like another block above it. Am I audible
Yes.
now?
Yeah. And there's another block below it as well.
Oh, is that the residential block below it?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was part of industries.
No. Industries is the lowermost tier.
So they've made another suburb essentially, and then a sort of richer suburb.
The central portion is also kind of a suburb,
Exactly,
So
there's the suburb
there's-
and then there's the richer suburb above it.
Yeah, the central residential block is actually straight out of ripped out of Garden City. You have medium rise blocks and you have gardens all around. That's the Garden City is in the middle. But what is happening below? And what is happening above?
Maybe there is
feel
a
there seems to be
separation.
a sort.
Yeah, go.
Aish, Aishwarya, go ahead.
There seems to be a sort of hierarchy to it, like social hierarchy may also apply. Like maybe the houses in the bottom are like for the commoners and the workers. The middle block is for like people who are maybe financially doing well off, and the top portion is this like rich people who have basically these gardens and all around it, and I don't know. That's how I see
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, that is correct. That's absolutely correct. It's not a relative view. That is exactly how he meant it. You know, it's in a way, there is a very kind of, um, you know, queer resemblance to the, um, you know, to the visualization of caste society. You know, you have the head and the shoulder and the thigh and the feet. You know, it's exactly that. On the top, those tower blocks that you see, those are government headquarters and corporate headquarters. You know, then you have you have that divided up with what is the text, hotels and conference halls and things like that. That's that white bar in the middle. Okay, then below that you have the body, which is the middle class housing, garden city. Then again a green strip that separates that with the working class blocks, where the workers live. And then below that, you have the factories. Now, one would think, okay, now when you make a diagram, all of your design students, you know, when you make a diagram, you also think about how do you arrange things in a diagram? You know, what do you put where? So what is being put where? Why is what happens if the diagram is upside down? How do you read it, right? As compared to this way? It wouldn't matter, right? I mean, you can turn around the north arrow is anyway not true. You can turn this around and it could be presented like that as well. But why is it that in a diagram like this, what is on the top, there is also a certain kind of, you know, when you make a diagram, you know that when you put something on the top, you're giving it, elevating it and giving it more importance. And when you're putting something down, it's usually a footnote, right? Now, in Corbusier's idea, of course, the city as a machine would not think of factories as an afterthought, but it still gives, so it is purely about a certain kind of social hierarchy, okay, which is very strong in Corbusier's visualization of the city. You know, just to give you a certain kind of historical background, Corbusier was, you know, he made this diagram of Villa Radius, which was actually rejected by the French. He wanted to completely remodel Paris on these lines, and the Parisians thought that he was completely nuts, and they, you know, and they drove him out. But he also later would make plans for, I don't know if they got realized or not, but he definitely did propose plans for the Soviet Union. And of course, the difference being that the corporate headquarters in the top were replaced by the party bureaucracy. You know, so obviously they were the top of the hierarchy, so they would go up. You know, but essentially the diagram remained the same. He also flirted with the fascists a little, because basically anybody who would be willing to buy his ideas. You know, Corbusier was very promiscuous when it came to his when it came to politics. Again, good stark contrast with the early modernists of the 1920s and the Bauhaus and so on, who are very committed kind of left-wing characters. So so you see this kind of hierarchical division of society and functions in the city, and this is how Corbusier imagined it. Now, what are the garden city elements here? Now, Corbusier had this very interesting way of thinking about it, saying that, look, if you want to create more open space, you go higher, and you can actually increase density and reduce densification by just building higher. And a large part of Corbusier's thought process was also very aesthetically driven. You know, he was quite an aesthete in that sense. He would think about the city as being seen in the night on water, and to see those towers, glittering towers, that was an important image to him. So a large part of these kind of plans were derivations from that imagery. So it's important to look at this diagram and to which gives you a good kind of picture of the thought process behind much of Corbusier's urban works. Okay, so now let's go to the text, and somebody please volunteer to read it. Who's reading? Tanvi, go ahead.
The evil that Le Corbusier lives after him, the good is perhaps interred with his books, which are seldom read for the simple reason that most are almost unreadable. The pictures, it should be said, are sometimes interesting for what they reveal of their draughtsmen, but the effort should be made.
Okay, one thing, Tanvi, sorry to interrupt, but this is just to introduce the book to you. This is written by Peter Hall, who is a very famous planning historian, in his book Cities of Tomorrow. And the whole book, if you read it, it's a great book to read. Actually, all of you should read it if you're interested in cities. And it is written with this kind of with a great degree of sarcasm. So even this early lines actually are written tongue-in-cheek. The evil that he did lives after him, and most of his texts are unreadable. And the pictures are interesting, not because they are good drawings, but what they reveal of the person who made them. So read it like that. Read it not as a serious academic text. This is not an academic text. Okay.
But the effort should be made because their impact on the 20th century city planning has been almost incalculably great. Obscurity is no barrier to communication, at least of a sort. Ideas forged in Parisian intelligentsia of the 1920s came to be applied to the planning of working class housing in Sheffield and St. Louis and hundreds of other cities too. In the 1950s and 1960s, the results were at best questionable, at worst catastrophic. How and why this should happen is one of the most intriguing, but also one of the most chastening stories in the intellectual history of modern planning. The Corbusian ideal city. Meanwhile, he had to make do with Borges' patrons. His plan vision of 1925 had nothing to do with neighborhood units, but was the name of an aircraft manufacturer who sponsored it. This helps explain the planes that fly, which with such insouciant disregard of air traffic control in between these and other Corbusian skyscrapers. It's 18 uniform, 700.
Sorry, Tanvi. So the reference here, I don't know if you have seen Corbusier's drawings, but you'll always find in his renderings of urban scapes planes flying in between the skyscrapers, right? So this is a reference to that, saying that the plan Voisin was actually the name of the manufacturer who paid for it, for these kind of drawings, for that plan especially. So Corbusier since then made it a habit to put planes in between all of his buildings that he sketched. Okay, go ahead.
Its 18 uniform 700-foot high towers would have entailed the demolition of most of the historic Paris north of Seine, save for a few monuments, some of which would be moved. The place Vendôme, which he liked as a symbol of order, would be kept. He was apparently quite unable to understand why the plan aroused such an outcry in the city council, where he was called a barbarian. He always thought that the Gothic cathedral builders of the 13th century Europe, through whose efforts over a mere 100 years, the new world opened up as a flower on the ruins, must likewise have been misunderstood in those first years when the cathedrals were white. He was deterred. The design of cities was too important to be left to the citizens. He developed his principle of planning most fully in La Villa Contemporaine and La Villa Reduce. The key was the famous paradox. We must decongest the centers of our cities by increasing their density. In addition, we must improve circulation and increase the amount of open space. The paradox could be resolved by building high on a small part of the total ground area. 13. This demanded, as Corbusier put it in characteristic capital letters, we must build on a clear site. The city of today is dying because it is not constructed geometrically. The needs of traffic also demanded total demolition. Statistics show us that business is conducted in the center. This means that wide avenues must be driven through the centers of our town. Therefore, the existing centers must come down. To save itself, every great city must rebuild its center. This was the first suggestion of its kind. Years later, it was to be taken up with a vengeance. But as Harry A. Anthony has pointed out, there is no recognition anywhere in it of the problem of garaging all these cars or of the environmental problems that would result from their noise and emissions. They are simply ignored. The way in which the new structure was to be achieved was, however, not uniform across the entire city. The contemporary city was to have a clearly differentiated spatial structure, and this was to correspond to a specific segregated social structure. One's dwelling depended on one's job. At the center were the skyscrapers of the plan Voisin, which Corbusier emphasized were intended as offices for the elite cadres, industrialists, scientists, and artists, including presumably architects and planners. 24 of these towers would provide for between 400,000 and 600,000 top people's job at 1200 to the acre, with 95% of the ground area left open. Outside this zone, the residential areas would be of two types: six-story luxury apartments for these same cadres and designed on the so-called step-back principle in rows, with 85% of the ground space left open, and more modest accommodations for the workers built built around courtyards on a uniform gridiron of streets, with 48% left open. These apartments would be mass produced for mass living. Corbusier had no time for any kind of individual idiosyncrasy. Well, did he call them cells? Not only would the units all be uniform, they would all contain the same standard furniture. Possibly, he admits, my scheme at first might seem to warrant a certain fear and dislike, but variations in layouts and generous tree planting would soon overcome this. And not only would the units be mass produced for the bourgeois elite, they would also be collectively serviced. Though it will still always be possible to have a maid or a children's nurse of your own, a family servant if you wish, in the radiant city. The servant problem would be solved. The core of the contemporary city clearly was a middle class sort of place, and in the midst of the office center, he created an entertainment and cultural complex to minister to their needs, where the elite would talk and dance in profound calm 600 feet above the ground. The blue collar workers and the clerks would not live like this, of course. Corbusier provided for them in garden apartments within satellite units. Here, too, there would be plenty of green space, sports facilities, and entertainments, but of a different sort, appropriate for those who worked hard for 8 hours a day. Unlike the Paris of 1920s, where rich and poor tended to live in close juxtaposition, La Villa Contemporaine would have been a completely class segregated city. The Corbusian legacy. The irony then was that the Corbusian city of towers was perfectly satisfactory for the middle class inhabitants whom he had imagined living their gracious, elegant, cosmopolitan lives in La Villa Contemporaine. It might even work for the solid, though traditional tenements dwellers of Glasgow, for whom the transition from a Gorbals rare and slum to the 20th floor seemed like an ascent to paradise. But for a welfare mother born in a Georgia shack and dumped in St. Louis or Detroit with a brood of uncontrollable children, it proved an urban disaster of the first magnitude. The sin of Corbusier and the Corbusians thus lay not in their design, but in the mindless arrogance whereby they were imposed on people who could not take them and could never, given a modicum of thought, ever have been expected to take them. The final irony is that in cities all over the world, this was condemned as the failure of planning. Planning, in the common or garden sense, means an orderly scheme of action to achieve stated objectives in the light of known constraints. Planning is just what this was not. But as John Lang has pointed out, it does belong to a genre of urban design as opposed to an empiricist paradigm, which seeks to work from experience of precedents that have worked well. This is a rationalist paradigm built on abstract ideas. Unfortunately, these ideas were tested on human guinea pigs, and therein lies a terrible object lesson for future planners, for future generations of planners.
Okay. I think this was amply clear. Any questions or doubts about this text? Something you didn't understand? Or something you want to add? Anyone wants to react to this?
This wasn't an academic sort of paper, right? It's more of a, well, I wasn't sure what it is more of. It's not an academic paper.
You thought it was academic?
No, I know, I kind of get the vibe of what it's going for. Like it's kind of just summary.
Shravan, we lose you in the middle.
Not in a sort of academic fashion.
Shravan, we keep losing probably the most important words here. Yeah, all the adjectives are lost. I think.
Okay, I think I found where exactly my mic on my PC is because my.
Okay, again he's gone. All right. Anyone else wants to say something? Now he's muted, but I can still hear him. Okay. Anybody else wants to comment or say something about this? Come on, guys. This is your subject. I mean, this is something that you've been through like for 3 years again and again. You can't have nothing to say about this.
I feel when he was designing this whole thing, he forgot about personalizing these spaces for them, and it was more that everything should be similar for these kind of people, and it should be this kind of thing for these rich people. And he actually kind of forgot about that personal touch, which that personal touch that should be there. Like though he forgot about people who will be living in these spaces, and he did not think how they would reside these spaces.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic if you forget about people that you're supposedly building for. Anyway, yeah, I mean that's true. It's not so much about the personal touch. Problem is actually what you said later was was more true than the first part, because it was not about the touch. It was just that there were no people. This was an abstract idea. Towards the end, if you see when he talks about the legacy of Corbusier, he says that first of all, this is not planning, and it's important for everybody to understand. Planning has got a very bad name after Corbusier, especially because of this kind of idea of what planning is. And when even today people talk about the Chandigarh plan, and there's a lot of criticism of the planning in Chandigarh. But if insofar as it is a Corbusierian idea of modernist, it's more, it's more urban design than planning, because literally the city is designed. It is not planned. Planning is a different kind of exercise. It's planning is what you do when you go to when you make a list to shop from a grocery store. That is planning. Planning is when you make a schedule for your classes. That's planning. It's basically things that you do to ensure that things go as that you can keep a track of things, that you can address needs as they arise, and so on. Planning is when you save food for the for the next 2 weeks, so that if there is a lockdown, you don't starve. That is planning. This is urban design. The problem is that around the world, everybody thinks this is what planning does. Planning creates a certain kind of a visual order, and the funny thing about this is that some people like planning for this reason, because you go to Chandigarh and you see, wow, such a ordered, manicured, sculptural city. And so this is what planning does, and that's why, okay, so look, Bombay is a mess because it's not planned. So if you design it on the lines of Chandigarh, suddenly all its problems supposedly will be solved. So this is the Corbusian legacy. It has almost changed the way in which people understand the what is considered to be urban planning. Um, in fact, Ebenezer Howard was talking about planning when he was talking about how land economics would work. That is planning, because he's thinking about, okay, how do you make sure that everybody can afford to live in the city? So you have the system whereby the land is bought on credit, and then there's a single rent and so on. That's planning. It's nothing to do with how the buildings look, or whether it's a grid, or whether it is random. So this is the essentially one of his legacies. And the other thing, the other legacy is very simply, just go down to that last paragraph, Arham. Very quickly, I'm forgetting one point. Yes. Yeah, the other part of this is that even as urban design, this was not urban design which was done in an experimental way, or an experiential way. It was not urban design done by looking at how people actually live, trying to come up with some inferences or learnings from it. How, for instance, how we do urban design in college in Kamla Raheja. Nobody says, make a nice diagram of a neighborhood and then go and build it. No, nobody does that. What you do is you go and study the place, you go and talk to people, you go and understand, map, you do all of these things, and then come up with some ideas as to, okay, so there is a certain kind of empirical approach, which this was not. This was idealistic. It was abstract, rationalist. The idea is that I make a diagram, and then everything should work in that manner. And that was, even as urban design, it was of a certain kind of urban design, right? So this was essentially the legacy that Corbusier left. Now, important to bear in mind is that Corbusier, when he went to Paris, like it says somewhere again in Peter Hall's typical form of writing, that the people in Paris thought he was a barbarian for trying to, I mean, imagine Paris. People in France think that they are the embodiments of the highest levels of civilization ever known to mankind, and somebody goes there and says, "Oh, just flatten your city and build towers." They thought he was crazy, which is exactly what happened. 30s, they just dismissed him. But what happened is all of Corbusier's ideas started being implemented mainly after the Second World War, because all of these, Paris was not flattened by Corbusier, but Paris was flattened by the Second World War. And then they had to rebuild. And when they had to rebuild, they realized that Corbusier's ideas were handy, they were available. You simply had to basically put together some grid somewhere and build high rises and by mass producing parts and so on. So it was an efficient and cheap way to build. It was not the incremental city that has developed over hundreds of years. It was a city that had to be built overnight, almost. So that's how after the war, suddenly many of these ideas kind of started being adopted. In fact, even Chandigarh, if you look at the way in which Chandigarh got built, it was Nehru's very conscious effort at breaking away from the past and not having any of the kind of baggage of feudal caste-based relations and so on. And so, he had to invite Corbusier to plan Chandigarh. Of course, I mean, so yeah, that's basically the story of this text. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also like an inversion of the plan of the earlier cities. Like the medieval city, you realize that the streets and the squares, etc., are framed by buildings. No? Buildings touch each other. They are also the open spaces are actually created by a kind of a arrangement of buildings, right, which kind of frame those spaces. The idea is Corbusier inverted that whole idea. So his idea was buildings in a park. So they were freestanding individual buildings which needed to be appreciated from a kind of a distant kind of a standpoint. They were also monumental in nature very often. So you realize that many of these capital cities that Corbusier built, it had these capital complexes which would have these monumental administrative buildings and the kind of secretariat, etc. So one kind and those buildings would be placed in a vast open space or plaza where from where people could visually appreciate the cultural qualities of these buildings. It was very different from the conception of the medieval cities or the earlier cities, be it Paris or even the Indian cities which existed here, which were also more responsive to the climate, which were kind of, which framed the streets, which shaded the streets. The scale of the spaces was such that it was conducive to human activity, which had markets and street vendors and hawkers. So there was a human scale to the places that was there in these earlier historic cities. And that whole idea disappeared, with this whole idea of vast gardens. And Corbusier's only idea of, what he wanted to retain from the past was, again, the monuments or the monumental architecture. So in his plan for Paris, he had proposed that only the monuments needed to be retained and the rest of the fabric of the medieval city would have to be erased and replaced by his plan of the radiant city. So it's like, monuments connected by these axial thoroughfares or, kind of streets and open spaces and plazas. So completely inverted the idea of the nature of open space in the historic city.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So we have maybe a few minutes for your responses, questions, comments. Anyone? How many of you have been to Chandigarh? No one? Okay. Aditya? So Aditya, what did you tell us? What you asked? Aditya, tell us what you. I mean, what did you think when you were there in Chandigarh? Your impressions at that time, not how you think about it now, but at that time, what did you think about? How did you think about it?
Like I wasn't into architecture that time, but it was long ago. So, like, but we visited like most of his work, like the Secretariat building and the whole complex there. That was kind of huge. Like when we entered into that, like the parliament, not parliament, the main building where the meetings and all those things were like happening. There was this huge ramps that were going. That were like, I don't know, but they were suggesting that this place is kind of very important. Like he was showing the functionality through his like forms, maybe.
No, but I mean, now you're talking like an architect. When you were there at that time, what did you think about?
Okay. It was like kind of when I just entered into that building, it was very rusty and then kind of old. Everything was dark, the ground floor, but as we like go up, it was getting like lit up. Like lights was entering from the windows or the slits that he made.
Well, you're still talking like an architect. It's impossible now for you to jump out of your skin. Like, don't tell me at that time you noticed, oh, ये light कितनी अच्छी तरह से गिर रहा है. Oh, crap. You was generally the first reaction to people is, अरे ये painting क्यों नहीं किया? अरे ये इतना यहाँ पे पेड़ क्यों नहीं है? There would be like those are reactions of people who are not trained to see buildings in a certain way. And there is absolutely nothing.
I was shocked more with like the structure, like like how the roofs is like sitting on it and all those things.
What did you think about the city? What did you think about the
Like the
city?
city. I was like staying in the like a complex, so we didn't like travel much. Like we were just like traveling to the desk, like point to points. But it was like good. Like there was this system that was going like of the roads, like the sectors that were replanned, and then like you have to tell like to the people, the rickshaw, the taxi drivers that I have to go to this particular sector and on this road. Like there was nothing like I want to go to this place. So they went like you have to like tell them like I want to go on this road. So this is the sector name and this is the thing. So that was very confusing.
Place names are also numerical. It's almost like a
Yeah.
grid you are navigating. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Ria, your hand is also raised. Shravan, you're going last. Ria, go ahead.
Yeah, so I lived there when I was like very young. But one thing that I can say, it seemed very ordered in a way. Um, everything, even the traffic, the way people were moving on the, people were walking on the pavements, and then you had separate layer for the trees and the vegetation, which were adding to the beautification. And also, it's hard to remember which road is which because all of the roads look the same. So yeah.
Yeah.
Also, there's something about the height of the structures there. I'm talking about way back where structures were limited to mid rises, but now there are more towers coming up in the outskirts of the city and in part of the city. Yeah. Also, it was very hot. It was very hot there, I think, because everything was very paved and all.
Very paved and very few trees. I mean, the trees are there, but they're scattered. No, they're like not like or lined in an avenue, or it's you have these large plazas which are completely devoid of any shading elements. And like Shweta mentioned, if you look at some of the vernacular building types go to any old town. I don't know if you guys have been to Nashik or you've been to even any of the older city fabrics, you'll find that in these hot conditions, generally in cities which have a similar weather conditions, buildings tend to move inwards as they go higher onto the street. Which creates a kind of it will be ever so slight. It's not very pronounced, but buildings as you go higher, the building tends to move towards the street, which creates a kind of a shade for the street. And usually pedestrian streets, or you find animals and people, not so much vehicles and so on, but that would create a amount of shade. If you go to on the other hand, if you go to European older cities, you will see that the buildings step back, because you want to allow the sun to come in because the sun is not so strong. So those were more incremental responses, like Christopher Alexander would call pattern language in many of the vernacular kind of settlements. But because Corbusier's and much of the modernist paradigm was about creating design or doing design which had a completely different logic. The logic was not climatic adaptation and so on. It was more about, although just to be fair to the modernists, there was some bit of thinking about these things, but it was also thought about in a very kind of rationalist manner. It was not something that came out of learning through experience and experiment. It was something that came out through through an abstract thought process. So you will find some of the modernists had these diagrams of how tall a building should be because of the shadow that it will cast and so on, but not the kind of experimental incremental architecture that you see coming out of vernacular towns. It's not to romanticize vernacular towns. It's just that these were certain elements that emerged over time through trial and error. But because what generally happens is when you move something to the realm of expertise and professions, the way in which knowledge is constructed becomes very different. It's not knowledge through experience, it's knowledge through abstract concepts. And that's generally what you see here as well. Okay, Shravan, go ahead.
Am I audible? And my phone's going.
Yes.
Am I
yes.
audible? Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. So I remember only visiting Chandigarh on my way to Shimla. So it was mainly the roads I kind of have a memory of. And the idea was that it actually seemed a lot like that main road going down JPD, the NS road. Except it's more open to sky and less Gujarati people. So yeah, in that sense,
I
it was
take
like,
offense to that. What is wrong with Gujarati people? I'm a Gujarati, Shravan. What are you trying to say?
nothing wrong. It's just that JPD has a lot of blend. This is like, that's it.
Okay, fine. Okay, good.
Yeah. I'm part Kutchi, so I don't know how that plays in, but yeah. Uh, so yeah, it was really open to sky, and there was like a lot of. I guess it goes down to the point of the heat again, and there were a lot of trees around. And, like, there's very few avenues in Mumbai. While I don't know if it's just a general thing, but every road I passed seemed to be an avenue almost until I got to the outskirts. So there was definitely the kind of idea of obviously talking about the nature and the gardens and the suburbs somewhat there. I mainly passed for a lot of public spaces, so I can't speak of the residences. But there were a lot of gardens and like avenues and stuff which I can remember, and a lot of white buildings, surprisingly. Like white and grey buildings, very neutral tones compared to like the more vibrant. Like if you go to Delhi, which is a planned city again, it still has some color in the buildings. While Chandigarh was heavily like neutral tones on the pastel scale.
Yeah.
Not on the pastel scale, just the white side of the grey scale.
Okay. All right. So then we shall put a stop to this class. Next week we'll be doing maybe the autonomous city. Yeah, maybe we'll do the autonomous city next week, and we'll just take it from there. Okay. Unless somebody has questions, we'll close. Shall I stop recording?